December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, 7:55 a.m. The sirens tore through the morning calm like a blade through silk. A sky once painted blue now seethed with black smoke and shrieking engines. The first wave of Japanese aircraft descended upon Battleship Row, diving low and screaming death onto the Pacific Fleet. Men who'd been half awake moments ago now sprinted, barefoot and half-dressed, across decks slick with oil and blood. From the flaming chaos aboard the USS Pennsylvania, the thunder of anti-aircraft guns rolled across the harbor. The world itself seemed to split open. The USS Arizona erupted in a blinding flash, a shockwave so vast it rattled the very earth beneath the base. Within 9 minutes, she was gone, burning, broken, sinking beneath the oily film of fire. But in a small, weather-worn house near the Washington Navy Yard, a 15-year-old boy named Calvin Graham was listening to the same broadcast, his heart pounding against a chest barely grown into a man's uniform. His mother was asleep. His elder brother was already at war. And Calvin, well, Calvin had already decided that the world wasn't going to wait for him to turn 17. He turned up the radio, catching the voice of the newscaster trembling among the static. The Pacific Fleet is under attack. Casualties are ... are significant. Calvin closed his eyes, feeling not fear, but purpose. When people spoke of heroes, they spoke of men, not boys. Not someone who still carried his school books when he wasn't carrying dreams. But Calvin had already learned that waiting for adulthood was a luxury the world could no longer afford. The next morning, he forged his mother's signature, lowered his birth year by 2, borrowed a neighbor's razor, and practiced nicking his face to make himself look older. By nightfall, he was standing before the Navy recruiter, chin high, voice steady. Name? Calvin Leon Graham. Age? 17, sir. The recruiter paused. The boy looked small, but there was something in his eyes, something sharp. Grown men sometimes falter under that gaze. It spoke not of innocence, but of stubborn, unshakable will. A moment of silence. Then the recruiter nodded. Welcome to the United States Navy, sailor. Calvin didn't breathe until the ink touched the paper. The stamp hit with a thud that echoed louder than any ceremony. That night, as he boarded the train to San Diego for basic training, he didn't think of what he'd left behind, his school books, his unfinished childhood, his mother's inevitable heartbreak. He thought only of the ocean, of ships so massive they made men feel small, and of the chance, no matter how slim, to stand on their decks and make a difference. He gazed out the window, watching the country blur past. Towns turned to fields, fields turned to desert, and finally the desert bled into the coast. The smell of salt caught the wind long before the Pacific came into view. When he stepped off the train, a faint cry of gulls greeted him. He straightened his uniform. It hung loose at the shoulders, tight at the collar. But that didn't matter. As far as anyone would see, he was another seaman ready to fight. In the coming months, Calvin Graham would train, laugh, and bleed beside men twice his age. But soon, the boy who'd cheated his way into the Navy would find himself aboard one of the most powerful battleships ever built, the USS South Dakota. And before long, when fire rained from the sky and steel screamed against steel, that same boy barely 15 would make a decision that would save an entire crew from the bottom of the Pacific. But that night, standing by the shore, all Calvin could hear was the endless breathing of the ocean, whispering like a promise. You wanted to fight, boy. The sea will test if you deserve to stand on her back. He didn't yet know how far the sea demanded a price. He would soon. The barracks at Naval Station San Diego were far from the heroic visions Calvin had imagined. They smelled of sweat, disinfectant, and fear. Rows of green wool blankets covered iron bunks, and the floorboards echoed with the heavy boots of men barking orders. faster than recruits could understand them. Calvin wasn't the youngest-looking kid there, but close enough. A smattering of acne on his chin betrayed his true age. He kept his mouth shut and mimicked the faces of those around him. Jaw tight, eyes forward, no hesitation. The trick wasn't to look old, it was to look like you belonged. From dawn till dusk, they ran drills that ground the edges off a boy's body. Rifle drills, knot tying, man overboard procedures, fire suppression. The instructors barked commands with the precision of gunfire, and every hesitation earned another 10 push-ups or a full sprint across the training yard. Calvin learned quickly that the Navy didn't care where you came from. It only cared whether you could endure. And he could endure plenty. At night, when the men collapsed onto their bunks, the air would fill with murmurs stories from Alabama, Brooklyn, Kansas farmland, all blending into a single hum of homes left behind. Calvin said little, listening instead. He didn't dare mention his age. If anyone suspected, he'd be sent home. Graham, one of his bunkmates, muttered one evening, tossing him a roll of cigarettes. "You don't talk much." "You married?" Calvin grinned faintly. "Not yet." Laughter rippled through the darkened barracks. The man nodded approvingly. "Smart kid. Keep it that way." By the end of the 6th week, Calvin's thin frame had hardened into muscle. He learned to fight the ocean's fury, to swim through oil-slicked water while carrying a rifle above his head. He learned the difference between discipline and duty, the line between life and death that hangs in every command. But there was more, something quiet unspoken. It was in the way the men sang softly while scrubbing decks late into the night, or in how they shared their rationed cigarettes when someone's hands shook after live fire. Brotherhood wasn't taught. It was forged. The arrival of the South Dakota. In June 1942, word spread through the base like wildfire. The USS South Dakota had docked off the coast. The ship was new, gleaming, and massive 35,000 tons of steel, packed with firepower unmatched by any other vessel afloat. Her turrets were built to shatter cruisers. Her armor could shrug off torpedoes. "You boys ever see a city float?" One of the petty officers said, his grin stretching wide. "You will now." When Calvin first saw her silhouette against the horizon, he swallowed hard. Even from a mile away, she looked alive like a beast waiting for command. The steel hull rose out of the water like a mountain, guns angled toward the clouds. Her name, painted white along her side, caught the morning sunlight. USS South Dakota, BB-57. He stared for a long time, realizing that this was the moment he'd been chasing since that radio broadcast. After the formal assignment order, he reported on board with dozens of other replacements. The corridors hummed with energy. The deck vibrated faintly beneath his boots, as if the sea itself recognized new blood. "Welcome to the Big Stick," a chief petty officer said. "This ship doesn't sink. Just don't make her angry." The crew laughed, but there was reverence in their tone, too. Calvin found his quarters deep below deck-tight bunks stacked 3 high, the air thick with the smell of oil and metal. He shared the space with fire control operators, gunners, machinists. Real men. Some had kids his age, back home. He tried to blend in, to move with quiet confidence, but more than once he caught someone staring, eyebrows drawn. "You look young, sailor," one said. Calvin's stomach tightened, but he forced a grin. "Yes, I've got good genes," the man chuckled. "Good genes or not, you better learn to move fast. When the alarm sounds, there's no time to wonder where the fire's coming from." Into the Pacific. The South Dakota left port that July, slicing through the Pacific under an endless sky. The routine aboard was relentless maintenance, gun drills, damage control practice, watch rotations through the night. Calvin became a loader on one of the 40mm anti-aircraft guns near the portside midship. It was grueling work. Every shell weighed nearly 5 pounds. And in battle, you'd feed hundreds of them in minutes, your arms burning, your ears ringing. But it was his spot, his responsibility, its place in the machine. During calmer moments, he would stand by the railings and watch the sun set across the water, the horizon bleeding orange and gold. He wondered if his mother was looking at the same sky back home. He didn't know that within months, this very deck would shake with explosions so near they'd shatter bones. That the serene Pacific he admired was already cursed by warships prowling beneath, waiting for blood. He didn't know that the decision he'd make during one of those nights, a choice born of instinct and courage, would save the entire battleship from going under. But the ocean already knew. It always knew. October 26, 1942, the Solomon Sea. The air was heavier than usual that morning. The horizon glowed a dim copper hue, and a faint drizzle speckled the steel deck of the USS South Dakota. Beneath that rolling dawn, the calm carried tension so thick you could feel it press into your skin. At 0700 hours, a shout cut across the deck. Contact bearing northwest. Form air defense. Sirens blared. The ship came alive. Men sprinted for their battle stations, boots pounding on steel, voices lost in the rising roar of engines. Calvin grabbed his helmet, heart hammering as he threw himself into his gun position, slamming shell after shell into the feed with mechanical rhythm. He had trained for this, but training always lied. It never showed the smell of burning oil. The chorus of men praying under their breath. The Japanese fleet was on the move again, waves of bombers and torpedo planes bearing down from the clouds. Above, Navy Hellcats intercepted them, twisting and diving in streaks of smoke and silver. But not all could be stopped. Calvin's gun crew locked in position. "Ready," he shouted. The loader beside him nodded, sweat already streaking through grime. Then they heard it, that high-pitched whine of descending bombs, slicing through the air like a banshee scream. Incoming! The deck shook violently as the first bombs hit water close by. Torrents exploded skyward. Shrapnel rained down, biting into steel hull and flesh alike. Calvin's jaw clenched so tight it ached. Every instinct told him to duck, but discipline beat instinct. His hands didn't stop. Target 9 o'clock. He swiveled the gun, sighting a streak of black descending from the clouds. A Japanese dive bomber, an ICD-3A Val, diving straight toward the South Dakota. The gun captain screamed coordinates. Calvin squeezed the trigger. The bark of the cannon thundered. Shells spat upward, bursts of orange tracers clawing toward the enemy. Then, for half a second, a miracle, a direct hit. The plane erupted mid-dive, disintegrating in a fiery blossom before crashing into the wake. Cheers erupted across the deck, but only for a moment. More came, always more. Shell casings clattered like rain. The air was a storm of smoke, debris, and screams. The South Dakota's guns fired until the barrels glowed. And through it all, Calvin kept moving, reloading, shooting, feeding the beast of war. Then suddenly, a sound he'd learned to dread, a blast, sharper than thunder, too close. The ship lurched as a bomb detonated on the main deck. His feet left the ground. He hit the bulkhead hard. For a moment, everything went white. When his vision cleared, smoke filled the air. Flames licked the edges of a ruined walkway. Men yelled names. Some answered, some didn't. Calvin pulled himself up, dizzy but conscious. "Medic!" someone screamed, voice cracking through the chaos. He saw them, sailors trapped under a collapsed railing, the fire creeping closer. Without thinking, Calvin grabbed an axe from the emergency crate, sprinted through open flame, and began hacking the twisted metal. Sparks kissed his arms. The smell of scorched paint filled his lungs. One man was freed, then another. "Kid!" a petty officer shouted through the heat. "Get down!" The fires. Boom! A secondary explosion threw Calvin backward. The world became a blur of orange and black. When he landed, his helmet was gone, and so was part of the bulkhead above. But the ship still floated. The South Dakota was bleeding smoke into the sky, but defiant. By late afternoon, the battle was over. The ship's kill count was staggering, over 24 Japanese aircraft downed. Her deck was scarred, her crew battered, but she had survived. And through it all, Calvin, the youngest sailor aboard, had fought like he'd been born for that deck. That night, while the damage control teams worked through the haze, the crew gathered in silence near the bow. No music, no chatter, just men staring over the ocean, counting the cost. The South Pacific was brutally quiet, a mirror of exhaustion and grief. Calvin sat with his back against the railing, his fingers still blackened with smoke, every muscle aching. One of the older seamen passed him a canteen. "You fought hard today, kid." "Didn't even flinch." Calvin nodded, but his throat was raw. "Couldn't flinch. Didn't have time." The man chuckled softly. "That's how you know you're Navy." Calvin managed a tired smile, but as he looked over the dark water, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The battle they survived was just one chapter in a war far bigger than he'd ever imagined. He thought he'd joined to help, but the ocean had other plans. The next battle would test him not as a fighter, but as a survivor. November 14th, 1942, off the coast of Guadalcanal. Midnight. Tropical heat pressed down over the sea like a living thing. The USS South Dakota moved silently through the black water, part of a task force armed to strike at the Imperial Japanese Navy. The men on board knew what waited. They'd seen enough of war to recognize the quiet before it erupted. Calvin Graham stood at his gun station, helmet low over his brow, sweat dripping down his neck despite the open night air. The sea shimmered faintly under the stars, ghostly and calm. He whispered under his breath, "Feels too quiet," to a nearby loader who just nodded grimly. From the bridge, commands crackled over the PA, flat and calm, the practiced voice of men who learned long ago not to let fear show through the wires. At 0020 hours, that quiet shattered. The ambush. Enemy inbound. Lights off. Sound silence. Then flashes. Dozens of them. The night lit up in white fury as Japanese naval guns erupted from the shadows. The South Dakota and her escorts plunged headfirst into the firestorm of the naval battle of Guadalcanal. The ocean itself seemed to ignite, tracer rounds slicing through the dark, shells exploding across the waves. Huge plumes of fire marked every direct hit. The air filled with the smell of cordite and burnt metal, and the sky flashed with the sickly glow of artillery bursts. Calvin barely had time to register direction. His gun crew was already moving, shouting numbers and bearings. "Target!" Bearing 20 degrees starboard, open fire. He swung the barrel, feeding ammunition as fast as his trembling arms allowed. The gun's recoil drove shock through his entire body with every shot. All around, voices echoed shouts, screams, orders, and beneath them, the unending growl of the ship's engines forcing her forward through hell. A shell screamed overhead, missed by feet, and exploded against the starboard turret. The blast threw molten metal across the deck, igniting paint and flesh alike. Men cried out. Calvin dropped to cover, the heat washing over him like the breath of a forge. Then came the torpedoes. He heard the lookout's voice before he saw it. "Fish in the water. Port side. Close." A thunderous impact tore through the ship's hull. The South Dakota lurched and groaned like some wounded creature. Lights flickered, then died. The ship plunged into total darkness, illuminated only by the gleam of enemy fire. "Generators are hit. Get the emergency power on." Calvin's heart hammered. For several seconds, everything felt unreal, just noise and chaos and light. Somewhere after, a secondary explosion ruptured a fuel line. Fire bloomed across the deck, thick and orange, feeding off the oxygen pouring from the shattered vents. He staggered to his feet. Around him lay twisted steel, bodies, scattered shells that clinked gently with every roll of the deck. The moment that defined him. The fire control circuits were down, communications offline. The officers couldn't relay orders fast enough. "Kid," someone shouted, "get to fire control. See if you can patch the line." "Me?" "Go." He didn't hesitate. He sprinted through corridors filled with smoke so thick it burned his eyes, his lungs screaming for air. Sparks crackled overhead. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes. Every step echoed like thunder. He reached the fire control room to find the operator slumped over the table, dazed. The main line was shredded, wires arcing. Calvin didn't think he acted. With hands still shaking, he stripped a piece of wire from a blown circuit, tied it to a junction box, and reconnected the line. Sparks leapt. The lights flickered. Then power. Below deck, the sound of the turrets roaring back to life shook the ship. The fire control chief spun toward him, eyes wide beneath a mask of sweat and soot. "Who the hell?" "Graham, sir," Calvin coughed. "Lines working." The man stared for a heartbeat before shouting into the com. "Batteries online. Fire at will." And just like that, the South Dakota struck back. Her main guns opened up with a fury that split the sea open. Massive 16-inch shells screamed into the night, each one trailing a comet's tail of fire before slamming into enemy hulls. 3 Japanese cruisers took hits in minutes. One disappeared into a bloom of flame. The darkness turned orange again, but now from their guns. Smoke rolled over the deck like mist. The temperature soared. Calvin stumbled toward the railing, gasping for air, his hands blistered and raw. He had no idea yet how many fires still raged below, or that ammunition rooms were seconds from detonation if the heat spread further. Survival by instinct. Down in the lower decks, he could hear the muffled shouts of trapped sailors pounding on sealed doors. Without waiting for orders, Calvin grabbed a firefighting hose and descended. The flames met him like a wall, bright, roaring, alive. He kept low, crawling, pulling the hose behind him, spraying arcs of water until the nozzle jammed. The sound of collapsing bulkheads echoed through the deck plates. He could feel the ship trembling beneath him, uncertain whether she'd hold. And in that moment, something in him broke through the fear. The exhaustion was gone. The pain was gone. There was only focus, raw and cold. He kicked through debris, dragged 2 unconscious men clear of the smoke, beat back fire with his jacket. He moved like someone who'd forgotten what hesitation was. When the last flames died down, he collapsed against the bulkhead, chest heaving. His uniform sleeves were singed off. His eyebrows are gone. His whole body shook from adrenaline. Above, the cannons still roared, but the South Dakota stayed afloat. She survived the night, barely. When the sun rose over Guadalcanal, the ocean was littered with the carcasses of burning ships, enemy and ally alike. The sea was calm again, eerily calm, carrying the wreckage of what had been one of the most brutal night battles in naval history. The South Dakota was scarred hull torn, bridges shredded, but she was alive. Her crew, too few to count, gathered on the deck in exhausted silence. Among the soot-streaked faces, one seemed out of place. Not older, not hardened, younger, too young. Calvin Graham, 15 years old, sat among men decades his senior, his hands still trembling from the fire he'd fought. No one spoke for a while. They didn't need to. They all knew. That night, the ocean had tried to claim their ship. And a boy who had no right even to be there, had helped save her. But the war wasn't done with him yet. The battle was over, but the silence that followed was worse than the cannon fire. Dawn revealed the true scope of devastation. The USS South Dakota, once sleek and proud, now limped through the Pacific like a wounded giant. Her decks were ravaged by fire. Twisted steel curled upward like burnt paper. The smell of cordite and charred paint clung to everything. Calvin stood near the aft tower, his uniform scorched, his right arm wrapped in a makeshift bandage. Around him, sailors moved quietly, tending to the fires that still smoldered in the bowels of the ship. Every clang of a hammer, every hiss of escaping steam, echoed through the battered hull like the groans of a living beast. Aftermath at sea. The damage control team worked around the clock. Sleep came in short bursts, half an hour on deck, before being shaken awake to help pump flooded compartments or haul debris. Food was cold tins, passed hand to hand. Every so often, someone asked for a cigarette, sometimes just to hold it. Calvin's head throbbed constantly, a mix of exhaustion and burns that stung with every movement. Yet he refused to report to sickbay. He didn't want anyone looking too closely at his paperwork or his birth date. When he did pass the medics, he heard them whisper, "Did you see that kid? He was in the fire line." Kid? Hell, he's probably younger than my brother. But no one questioned it out loud. In war, you didn't ask where courage came from. You just thanked God it existed. By the time the South Dakota limped into safe waters near Noumea, the ship looked like a survivor of apocalypse. Holes the size of trucks gaped in her superstructure. The ship's log later recorded that she'd taken 42 direct hits that night. 42, and still afloat. When the lists of the wounded were compiled, Calvin's name appeared among them. Facial burns and shrapnel lacerations. He could barely move his jaw from swelling when an officer called him over. "You," the officer said, studying his soot-blackened face. "Are you the one who reconnected the communications line?" Calvin hesitated. "Yes, sir." "And who led the last fire suppression down near the aft magazines?" He glanced at the deck, then nodded. The officer was silent for a moment, then gave a faint, weary smile. "Good work, sailor. You saved this ship, whether you know it or not." Calvin saluted, unsteady but proud. The gesture hurt. Every muscle in his body protested, but he didn't show it. What he didn't realize was that the same report would soon travel up the chain of command, eventually reaching Washington. His name would be penciled next to a commendation for bravery under fire. They wouldn't learn the truth of his age, not yet. Return to the States. By spring 1943, the South Dakota was repaired and reassigned. Calvin was transferred ashore for recovery after his wounds worsened. He was still just 15, but he'd seen more of death and fire than most men twice his age. At the Naval Base Hospital in Bremerton, Washington, rows of cots filled a drafty ward. The boy who had lied his way into the Navy now lay among heroes' men missing arms, legs, eyes. They played cards, smoked, told stories to keep the nightmares at bay. A nurse paused by Calvin's bed one afternoon. "What's your age, sailor?" she asked casually, flipping through his records. Calvin froze. He felt the cold trickle of fear slide down his spine. 17, Mom?" Her brow furrowed. 17? She tilted the folder just enough for him to see his own hospital chart, where a pen had scratched something faint but unmistakable. Date of birth, April 3rd, 1930. The silence stretched long. Then she closed the folder softly. "Rest up," she said, turning away. But in her voice, there was something he couldn't read, sympathy or secrecy. Maybe both. Word traveled faster than he expected. Military investigators soon took notice. When officers finally confronted him, their questions were sharp, clinical. Name, birthplace, school, parents' names. The truth unraveled faster than he could patch it. One of them slammed a file shut. "You're 15 years old." Calvin's throat tightened. "Yes, sir." "You falsified government documents, impersonated an adult, and joined active combat operations." He didn't know what to say. All the words that came to mind, honor, duty, courage, sounded useless in that room. Why? One officer finally asked. Because my country was at war, he said quietly, and I didn't want to wait for permission to defend it. The room was silent. The officer finally sighed. Son, that's not bravery. That's madness. But even as he spoke, there was no real anger, only disbelief. 15. It seemed impossible. Justice and punishment. The Navy didn't know what to do with him. He'd fought bravely, disobeyed bureaucratic lines, and embarrassed the recruiting process all at once. So they made him an example. His medals were stripped, his pay withheld. His honorable discharge was reclassified as undesirable. Calvin left the base with a bandaged jaw, wearing a worn uniform 2 sizes too big, clutching a duffel bag that had once held the only world he knew. Outside the gate, he paused, taking one last look back at the ships moored in the distance. Rusted hulls gleamed under the gray afternoon light, the faint smell of diesel drifting on the wind. Every clang, every flag snapping in the breeze sounded like a memory already fading. He wasn't angry, not yet. He was just empty. The Navy had been his home, his purpose, the one place where nobody had called him a child. Now, stripped of that identity, he felt smaller than he'd ever been. What he didn't know was that history would eventually find him again. The headlines, the hearings, the redemption. But for now, the boy who had saved a battleship was just a name scratched from the record, his truth buried beneath wartime bureaucracy. And somewhere across the Pacific, the South Dakota still sailed, her scars healed over, her decks washed clean. She carried the memory of that night like a heartbeat, even if the world tried to forget the boy who'd kept her alive. Spring 1944, Houston, Texas. The war was still raging overseas, but for Calvin Graham, it might as well have been another lifetime. The 15-year-old who had saved a battleship now limped through cracked southern sidewalks, jaw still wired from surgery, medals gone, and reputation torn apart. The city buzzed with life, trains hauling soldiers westward, parades full of flags, and women pinning up gold stars in windows, but none of it felt real to him anymore. He stood apart from it, each noise a reminder of a world that had moved on without him. The return home. His mother met him on the front steps, arms folded tight. "You lied to them," she said before he could speak. "You lied to me." Calvin wanted to explain how he'd done it for the right reasons, how he'd saved real lives, but the words died on his tongue. How could she understand the noise, the fire, the faces of men who'd called him brother? He simply nodded, eyes low. "I did what I had to, Ma." She turned away, her silence colder than any stare. Behind her, the radio played another bulletin from across the Pacific. The Marines pushing forward. More names, more deaths. At night, Calvin would lie awake staring at the ceiling, the glow of passing headlights flashing through his window like searchlights across the deck. The sound of trains became engines, the whistle became sirens. Every night, the same dream. Fire. The iron shriek of metal. The boy who didn't flinch. And he'd wake up shaking, heart pounding, the smell of smoke still in his lungs. War doesn't end when the guns go quiet. It clings to you. A country that turned its back. When he tried to apply for veterans' benefits, the paperwork came back, stamped in bold black ink. Ineligible. Age disqualification. The clerk barely looked at him when he pleaded. "Look," she said, sighing, "you lied to enlist. There's nothing we can do." "I fought in Guadalcanal," Calvin said. "I was wounded. I've got scars." "I'm sorry," she interrupted, and the word sorry sounded like a door slamming shut. He walked out into the heat, clutching those papers in his hand. It hit him then, right there on a bustling Houston street, that the country he'd nearly died for had no place for his story. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a civilian. He was nothing in between. He found work where he could. Odd jobs, shipyards, painting fences. The calluses came back, though not the pride. Each day was a kind of silence, and each night the battle replayed itself again, relentless, unstoppable. The physical pain was easy enough. Burns heal, bones mend. But the invisible one, the feeling of being erased, that stuck deeper. Growing up too fast, by 16, Calvin moved out. Too proud to stay, too scarred to fit in. Work took him to the Gulf Coast. He picked up cigarettes, whiskey, and a reputation for working harder than anyone twice his age. But sometimes, if someone mentioned the Navy, he'd fall quiet. "You were in the war?" they'd ask jokingly. "Something like that," he replied. Then he'd change the subject, eyes drifting somewhere far away, maybe back to that night when the ocean caught fire, when every decision mattered, when he still believed heroes got remembered. One headline, one spark. It wasn't until 1948 that a flash of redemption came. A local journalist ran a small piece in the Houston Chronicle titled, "Boy Hero of Guadalcanal, Navy's Youngest Veteran." The story spread like wildfire. The public could scarcely believe it. A 12-year-old signing up for service would be scandal enough, but fighting at 15? Saving a battleship? Americans demanded answers. How could their Navy punish a child for courage? Letters poured in. Reporters called. Veterans wrote from overseas saying, "We fought beside him. He earned everything." Calvin, suddenly thrust into the light again, didn't know how to feel. Pride, maybe. Or exhaustion. He appeared on radio interviews, speaking slowly, modestly, always downplaying what he'd done. "We all did what we had to," he said. "I just happened to be there when it mattered." But that resurgence didn't last. Bureaucracy has long memory, and fame has a short one. The Navy refused to reverse his discharge. His medals remained revoked. The public outrage burned bright and then burned out. And when the headlines faded, Calvin went back to work. But something inside him shifted. The boy who had once believed in the sea's calling now felt its betrayal. Still, somewhere deep down, part of him held on to the idea that truth could outlive silence. Years later, he'd test that faith again. The war had ended, but for Calvin Graham, the fight had only changed battlegrounds. No more torpedoes, no fire in the sky. This time, it was paperwork, hearings, government departments that spoke in codes and delays. His enemy wasn't the Japanese Navy. It was indifference, the veteran they forgot. By 1949, he was barely 19, but looked much older. His face lined by too many sleepless nights and too many impossible hopes. He had tried to enlist again, twice, both times turned away. Not because of his record in battle, but because the Navy couldn't reconcile the contradiction of his file. Too young to have served, too damaged to be untouched by it. He held down jobs when he could: dock work, truck driving, carpentry. Anything that kept his hands busy and his mind off that black, burning sea. But some nights, usually when the world was quiet and the air thick with Gulf humidity, the memories came crawling back. He'd see flashes, the concussion of exploding rounds, the taste of metal in his mouth from the fire, his hands shaking as he patched that communication line, and the screams. Always the screams. He started taking sleeping pills when whiskey stopped helping. One bottle turned into two. He wasn't drinking to forget. He was drinking to slow down the remembering. The cost of being a ghost. By 1950, he had a wife. A young woman named Mary, who thought his scars made him look mysterious. She knew some of the story, the boy sailor rumors, but she didn't know the rest. Calvin tried to hide the nightmares from her. When he thrashed in his sleep, she learned to wake him by name, quietly, from a distance. When their first child was born, he looked at that tiny face and felt a moment of peace he hadn't thought possible. For the first time since the war, the world didn't feel like a weapon pointed at him. But money was tight. His old jaw injury split open one day while he was roofing in the summer heat. He couldn't afford surgery. The hospital refused care. No veteran benefits, no coverage. He left that night with gauze on his face and anger filling the space where hope used to live. How was it possible that a government could thank him for his service with silence? That the country he bled for could decide he didn't count because he'd been brave too soon? That question would follow him for decades, fighting for recognition. In the early 1950s, his story resurfaced thanks to an old shipmate, a gunner's mate named Joseph Lucas, who had never forgotten the kid. Lucas wrote letters to local officials, to newspapers, to veterans groups. "He saved our ship," he wrote. "We're alive because he never froze when the rest of us would have." Eventually, the issue reached the Navy Review Board. Calvin received a summons to testify. He walked into that hearing wearing the same uniform jacket he'd kept for years, though it no longer fit right. Across the table sat half a dozen officers who had likely never seen combat in the Pacific. Their eyes were polite but detached. "You're seeking reinstatement of your medals and service recognition," one said. "Yes, sir." "You admit you falsified your enlistment?" "I do." "And you were 15 at the time?" "Yes, sir." There was a long pause. Papers shuffled. The room was heavy with bureaucracy, not morality. "Mr. Graham," another officer finally said, "you were a child." Regulation prohibits retroactive recognition in such cases. "We can't reward deception, no matter the results." Calvin exhaled slowly. "With respect, sir, I didn't join to be rewarded. I joined because my country needed me. The medals don't matter. The record does." But the request was denied. Again. When he stepped outside the old Navy building, the sunlight burned his eyes. Reporters waited at the gate, shouting questions. He ignored them all. For the first time in years, he realized how tired he was, not of life, but of proving to the world that he'd lived it honestly. A glimmer of change. By the 1970s, America had new wars, Korea, then Vietnam, and new young soldiers to tell stories about. Calvin's tale faded again, nearly lost to time. Occasionally, a history magazine mentioned the child sailor of Guadalcanal, but always as a curiosity, never as a man. He was in his 40s by then, lining up at a Houston VA clinic one afternoon when a nurse took his file, flipped through it, and frowned. "You were at Guadalcanal?" "Yes, ma'am." "With South Dakota?" "That's impossible. Says here you were 15. He smiled faintly. "Yeah, that's why they don't believe me." The nurse paused, then whispered, "They should." That small sentence, those 3 words, would echo in him for years. It wasn't an apology, but it was validation. He went home that night, opened a box he hadn't touched in 20 years. Inside were the burnt edges of old documents, 2 photographs from the ship, and a piece of shrapnel he'd kept from that November night. He held it to the light, watching how it caught the glow of his kitchen bulb. It almost looked like a medal. But medals, he thought, didn't always come from committees. Sometimes they came from memory, from the men who saw you when the world refused to. Still, in 1978, one last chance would come knocking. The late 1970s found the political climate changing. Vietnam was over. Public trust in the military was fractured, and America had finally begun to wrestle with how it treated its veterans. Somewhere inside those growing conversations, an old reporter rediscovered Calvin Graham's story. A feature in a national magazine. The boy who saved a battleship reignited everything. People were stunned to learn he was still alive, still unrecognized, still fighting for something he'd earned at 15. Congressional offices were flooded with letters. Veterans wrote to the Navy Secretary, some enclosing signed statements. "I was there." The boy did what he said he did. One by one, memory began to outweigh bureaucracy. Television producers reached out. His story aired nationally, portraying him not as a scandal, but as a lost chapter of bravery. Children wrote him letters calling him a hero. Old sailors wrote to say thank you. The tide had finally turned. Justice had lost. In 1978, over 3 decades after the Battleship fire, the Navy formally reviewed Calvin's record. The final letter arrived in a plain envelope. His hands shook as he opened it. Inside, printed in blue ink across crisp government stationery, the Department of the Navy hereby approves the reinstatement of Seaman Calvin Graham's honorable discharge status and awards all previously rescinded medals of valor, including the Bronze Star and Purple Heart. He stared at the words for a long time, not crying. He had run out of tears years ago, but smiling, a slow, quiet, disbelieving smile. Finally, the truth had outlived the silence. Legacy. The years after brought modest peace. Calvin spoke at schools, veterans' halls, and local events. He never exaggerated his story. He didn't need to. People leaned closer the quieter he spoke, held breath when he described that black night in the Pacific. He always ended the same way. I wasn't brave because I wasn't scared. I was brave because I did it anyway. He lived simply, surrounded by family and grandchildren who knew Papa Calvin more by his jokes than by his scars. When asked why he never grew bitter, he smiled and shrugged. The sea gave me my lessons. The rest was paperwork. When he passed away, the Navy sent a wreath. His medals, now properly framed, hang on the wall beside his photo in uniform, the face of a boy who looked far too young to be saving lives. And somewhere out there, the USS South Dakota's name still glints across naval records. A ship saved by calm courage in chaos, by a 15-year-old who refused to let her sink. History nearly forgot Calvin Graham, but the ocean never did. Every dawn that rolls across the Pacific carries a whisper of that night. The fire, the smoke, the boy who wouldn't run. Some stories fade. His endures, steady as the tide, carved into the memory of the sea itself.